He thought he was just helping a stranded woman on a snowy road. But when a black SUV pulled up to his house the next day, he realized he had changed his life forever. The road was nearly swallowed by the endless stretch of white. Snow covered everything: the trees, the fences, the distant rooftops barely visible through the swirling frost. The sun was up, but its light was weak, struggling to break through the heavy winter sky. Daniel Carter tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his breath fogging up the windshield, despite the heater blasting at full power. He had just finished a long shift at the auto shop and was eager to get home. His fingers ached from the cold, his back sore from a day spent under cars. But just as he rounded a bend, something made him slow down. A black sedan sat motionless on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking weakly. The back tire was completely flat. A woman stood beside it, arms wrapped around herself, her breath visible in the freezing air. She wore a thick coat, but even from a distance, he could see her shivering. Daniel hesitated. The road was deserted, no other cars in sight. He could just keep driving. But something about the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting someone, or something, to appear, made him pull over. Stepping out, the cold hit him like a wall. "Need a hand?" he called out. The woman turned sharply, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of relief and hesitation. She was young, mid-30s maybe, with high cheekbones and a sharp jawline. Snowflakes clung to her curls, and her lips were trembling, whether from fear or cold, he couldn't tell. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please." Daniel crouched by the tire, brushing away the snow. "Got a spare?" She nodded quickly, glancing around again. "In the trunk." Something was off. Most people stranded on the side of the road were either frustrated or grateful for help, but she was neither. She was anxious, as if she wasn't just stranded, but hiding. Still, he said nothing. He had met all kinds of people in his line of work. Some just didn't like accepting help from strangers. He popped open the trunk and pulled out the spare. It was brand new, untouched. "Lucky for you, this one's in perfect shape," he muttered as he got to work. She didn't respond. Instead, she paced, rubbing her arms, eyes flickering toward the empty road. "You from around here?" he asked, trying to fill the silence. "No." Short answer, no explanation. He glanced up at her, but her gaze was locked on something in the distance. Daniel worked fast, his fingers numb as he secured the new tire. Just as he was finishing, she took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Thank you," she said. He stood, wiping his hands on his jeans. "No problem. Should hold up fine till you get to a shop." She hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a neatly folded $100 bill. "Here. For your trouble." Daniel shook his head. "Don't need it." Something flashed across her face, something like fear. She pressed the bill into his hand anyway. "Please, just take it." The urgency in her voice unsettled him. But before he could question it, she was already getting into the car, slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life, and within seconds, she was gone, her tires kicking up a flurry of snow. Daniel stood there for a long moment, watching the road where her car had disappeared. His fingers clenched around the bill, its crisp edges biting into his palm. Something wasn't right, and he had a feeling, whatever it was, he hadn't seen the last of her. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of tires crunching over snow. It was still early, the pale winter sun barely creeping over the rooftops. He groggily pulled back the curtain and froze. A black SUV sat idling at the curb outside his house. The vehicle was sleek, tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. Daniel's gut tensed. It wasn't the kind of car you saw around here. Too expensive, too out of place in a neighborhood filled with rusted trucks and old sedans. He stepped away from the window, heart thudding. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe a neighbor had visitors. But then, 3 sharp knocks at his front door. Daniel inhaled slowly, willing himself to stay calm. He wasn't the type to scare easy. But something about the way the woman had acted last night, the way she had practically thrown money at him before speeding off, it gnawed at him. He opened the door. 2 men stood on his porch, both in black coats, their breath curling in the cold air. The first man was tall, broad-shouldered, with a sharp gaze that swept over Daniel like he was assessing a threat. The second was slightly shorter, but there was an edge to him, a quiet, restrained power in the way he stood. And standing between them, her hands tucked deep into her coat pockets, was the woman from last night. She looked different now, not anxious, not scared, composed. "Mr. Carter," the taller man said, his voice low, measured. "We need to talk." Daniel's fingers curled around the edge of the door. "About what?" The woman stepped forward. "Last night," she said, "you didn't just help me change a tire." Daniel exhaled sharply, glancing past them toward the SUV. It sat there like a silent threat, the engine humming softly. Every instinct in his body told him to shut the door, to walk away. But something in her voice, the way she said it, told him he needed to listen. He stepped aside. "Come in." The warmth of his house did little to ease the tension. The 3 of them moved inside, the 2 men standing near the doorway, the woman slowly removing her gloves as she studied him. "My name is Alana," she said finally, "and I need you to understand something, Daniel. Last night, you saved my life." Daniel frowned. "I just changed your tire." The shorter man let out a breath, something between a chuckle and a sigh. "You really think that was just a flat?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "What are you saying?" Alana set her gloves down on the table. "Someone slashed my tire," she said, "and they weren't trying to leave me stranded. They were making sure I couldn't leave." The room seemed to shrink. Daniel felt a prickle of unease run up his spine. "Who?" Alana hesitated, glancing at the men beside her. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, she said, "People who don't take kindly to me saying no." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. He wasn't an idiot. He had spent enough time around shady mechanics, around desperate people, to know when someone was in deep trouble. "And now they think I had something to do with it," he muttered. The taller man, who still hadn't introduced himself, nodded. "They saw you." Daniel's stomach clenched. "They don't know who you are yet," Alana said quickly, "but they will. And once they do, they're going to start asking questions." Daniel let out a humorless laugh. "Great. So what? You came here to warn me?" Alana held his gaze. "I came here to ask for your help." Silence stretched between them, thick, heavy. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling against the windows. "You don't even know me," Daniel said finally. "No," Alana admitted, "but last night you stopped, when no one else did, and that tells me everything I need to know." Daniel glanced at the 2 men again. He didn't know what world they belonged to, but he could feel it. Dangerous, calculated, filled with rules he didn't understand. He could walk away right now. Close the door, pretend none of this happened. Or he could step in. And whatever was waiting for him on the other side of that decision, he had a feeling there was no going back. Daniel leaned against the edge of his kitchen table, arms crossed, eyes locked onto Alana. The weight of her words settled heavy in his chest. "You want my help?" he repeated, voice edged with disbelief. Lady, I don't even know what I'm supposed to be helping with. Alana exhaled, glancing at the two men beside her. The taller one, clearly the one in charge, spoke up. Her father, he said simply. The man she's running from. Daniel scoffed. Great. And who's her father? The man didn't answer right away. He just held Daniel's gaze, as if waiting for him to connect the dots himself. Then it clicked. There weren't many powerful families in this state, but there was one name everyone knew. The Holloways. A family built on old money, political influence, and whispered rumors of control that extended far beyond what the public could see. Daniel straightened. You're telling me you're a Holloway? Alana's jaw tightened. I was. A heavy pause. Daniel shook his head. Okay, let me get this straight. Your family is worth more money than I'll ever see in my lifetime, and yet you were stranded on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere with a slashed tire. Because I ran, Alana said simply. And when you run, you lose everything. Money, connections, protection. I had one chance to disappear, but someone found me first. Daniel frowned. Who? Alana's expression darkened. My father's men, or at least the men he sent after me. They were supposed to take me back. I wasn't supposed to have a choice. Daniel let out a low whistle. And now they think I helped you escape. They don't just think it, the taller man said. They know. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken consequences. Daniel ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. So what now? You telling me I should pack up and skip town? Alana shook her head. Number. That's exactly what they expect you to do. And if you run, they'll assume you have something to hide. Daniel let out a dry laugh. Right. So, what? I just go about my day like nothing happened? Alana met his gaze, something almost pleading in her expression. Number, you let us protect you. Daniel's stomach tightened. He had no doubt these men could protect him. But at what cost? He wasn't a man who liked debts, especially not the kind that came with ties to people like the Holloways. He rubbed his temples. I should have just kept driving. The shorter man chuckled. Maybe. But you didn't. Daniel glanced out the window, at the black SUV still sitting outside like a silent guardian, or a warning. And what happens if I say no? Alana's lips parted, but it was the tall man who answered. Then they'll come for you, and we won't be here to stop them. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. He didn't doubt it. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. All right, fine. Let's say I agree to this. What does protection mean exactly? You guys park outside my house with guns and wait for trouble. Alana shook her head. It means we make sure they believe you had nothing to do with me, that you're just some random mechanic who stopped to help a stranger. Daniel raised a brow. And how do you plan to do that? The tall man smirked. We make sure they find someone else to blame. Daniel didn't like the sound of that. Alana must have noticed his hesitation because she stepped closer. No one innocent will get hurt, I promise you that. But these people, my father's people, they don't stop. Once they think you're involved, you're in danger. The only way to fix that is to shift their attention elsewhere. Daniel studied her, searching for any sign of deception. But all he saw was a woman who had spent her entire life running from something far bigger than him. He exhaled slowly. And if I say yes to this, how long until it's over? Alana's gaze softened. Not long. Daniel looked between her and the men at her side. He wasn't a fool. He knew once you stepped into a world like this, there was no clean way out. But if the alternative was waiting for a group of powerful men to decide when and how they'd come for him, then maybe he didn't have a choice. He nodded once. All right, I'm in. Alana let out a breath she'd been holding. Thank you. Daniel waved a hand. Don't thank me yet. Because something told him this was only the beginning. The plan was simple. Or at least, that's what they told him. Daniel was supposed to go about his day as if nothing had happened. Show up at work, talk to the regulars, pretend he wasn't looking over his shoulder every 5 minutes. But pretending was a lot harder when you knew someone was hunting you. It didn't take long for them to make their move. He was locking up the shop late that evening when he saw them. 2 black sedans parked across the street, their engines running. The streetlights flickered above them, casting long shadows over the snow-covered pavement. Daniel tightened his grip on his keys, forcing himself to breathe evenly. He had expected this. Alana had warned him. Still, knowing it was coming didn't make it any easier. The first man stepped out, a thick-built guy in a tailored black coat, the kind of man who looked like he broke kneecaps for a living. The second was leaner, sharper, his hands buried deep in his pockets. Daniel turned to walk away, but the bigger man called out, "Mr. Carter." Daniel stopped, not because he wanted to, but because running would only make things worse. He turned slowly, forcing himself to look unimpressed. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice steady. The big man smirked. "We were hoping you could answer a few questions for us." Daniel crossed his arms. "About what?" The lean man stepped forward, eyes sharp. "About a woman, black sedan, flat tire. Sound familiar?" Daniel felt his pulse quicken, but he kept his expression blank. "I fix cars all day. You'll have to be more specific." The big man chuckled, a slow, knowing sound. "Come on, Carter. We know she was here. We know you helped her. What we don't know is where she is now." Daniel exhaled through his nose. "I don't know either." A beat of silence. Then the lean man stepped closer, just enough to make Daniel feel the weight of the moment. "See, the problem is, we don't believe you." Daniel clenched his jaw. He knew where this was going. They weren't just here to ask questions. They were here to send a message. The big man cracked his knuckles. "How about we go for a little drive? Maybe a change of scenery will help you remember." Daniel tensed, his mind racing. He could fight, but that wouldn't end well. He could run, but they'd catch him. And then, before he could decide, everything changed. The sound of screeching tires cut through the night, followed by the blinding glare of headlights. A black SUV skidded to a stop behind them, its doors flying open. Alana stepped out first, but she wasn't alone. The 2 men from before, her protectors, moved like shadows, their presence shifting the balance of power in an instant. The big man turned, eyes narrowing. "What the?" Before he could finish, one of Alana's men pulled back his coat, just enough to reveal the glint of a gun. A beat of silence, the air thick with the unspoken threat. The lean man swallowed hard. "We didn't come here for trouble." Alana stepped forward, her voice calm but deadly. "Then you shouldn't have come at all." The big man clenched his fists, his jaw ticking with frustration. But he wasn't stupid. He knew he was outmatched. He turned back to Daniel, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "This isn't over." Daniel met his gaze, unflinching. "Yeah," he said. "It is." The 2 men hesitated for a moment longer before finally backing off. They climbed into their car and drove away, disappearing into the snowy night. Daniel let out a slow breath. Alana turned to him. "You okay?" Daniel let out a dry chuckle. "Define okay." She smiled, but there was something in her eyes, something unreadable. "You did good," she said. Daniel shook his head. "You did good. I just stood here and almost got my ass kicked. Alana smirked. Well, welcome to my world. Daniel exhaled, glancing back at the empty street. He had a feeling this wasn't the last time trouble would come knocking, and somehow, he wasn't sure if he wanted it to be. The silence stretched long after the black sedans disappeared into the snowy night. The tension still clung to the air, thick and heavy, like a storm that had passed, but left destruction in its wake. Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. His pulse was still racing, his muscles tight with the adrenaline that hadn't quite faded. He had just faced down men who could have easily ended him, and yet, somehow, he was still standing. Alana watched him carefully. You handled that better than most. Daniel let out a dry laugh. Yeah, because I feel like I just barely survived a really bad decision. One of her men, tall, sharp-eyed, smirked. Surviving is the important part. Daniel shook his head, glancing at the SUV still idling at the curb. So what now? They're just gonna let this go? Alana's expression hardened. Number. But they'll think twice before coming at you again. Tonight was a warning, for both sides. Daniel frowned. Great. So I'm just supposed to live my life waiting for the next time they show up? Alana hesitated, then stepped closer. You could walk away from this. Forget it happened. Go back to your normal life. Daniel studied her, really looked at her. She was different from the woman he had met on the side of the road. Stronger, steadier, no longer running. But there was something else, too. Something unspoken between them. And what if I don't want to walk away? He asked. Alana held his gaze, her lips curving into the smallest smile. Then you might want to get used to looking over your shoulder. Daniel let out a slow breath, glancing at the snow-covered road stretching out before him. He had a choice. He could pretend this never happened, step back into the quiet, predictable life he had built. Or he could step forward, into something uncertain, dangerous. But maybe, just maybe, worth it. Alana turned toward the SUV. If you ever need anything, she said over her shoulder, you know where to find me. And just like that, she was gone. Daniel stood there long after the black SUV had disappeared into the snowy horizon. The cold bit at his skin, but he barely felt it. His world had changed in less than 24 hours, all because he stopped to help a stranger on the side of the road. He glanced down at his hands, the faint scent of motor oil still clinging to his fingers. Yesterday, they had only been the hands of a mechanic, fixing cars, paying bills, living a quiet, simple life. But today, they were the hands of a man who had just stepped into something much bigger than himself. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. What the hell did I just get myself into? A chuckle escaped his lips, half amusement, half disbelief. He could have ignored that broken-down car, kept driving like everyone else. But he hadn't. And now? Now, he wasn't sure if he regretted it or not. Maybe life had a funny way of leading people exactly where they needed to be. Daniel turned and walked back into his house, locking the door behind him. But as he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Sometimes, a simple act of kindness can change everything. Have you ever experienced a moment where one small decision led to something unexpected? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Who knows? The next story might just be yours.